Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law on Film, a podcast that explores law through film and film through law. Each episode looks at a different film to examine the various ways law operates across institutions, society, and culture, not just inside, but also outside courtrooms. In this episode, we turn to a case that sits at the uneasy boundary between criminal adjudication, media power, and moral authority, the prosecution and execution of Aileen Wuornos, also labeled the first female serial killer. We look at two documentaries by Nick Broomfield, Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer from 1992, and Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer from 2003, alongside the feature film Monster, written and directed by Patty Jenkins and starring Charlize Theron in a widely acclaimed Oscar-winning role. Broomfield's documentaries are less about guilt or innocence and about process, who controls the narrative, how legal representation operates, and what happens when a defendant's life becomes an object of transaction between lawyers, media, and the public. The films also penetrate the issues around the application of the death penalty in the United States and the problems that arise when the state seeks to execute individuals who are themselves victims and suffer from severe mental illness. Monster approaches the same facts through dramatization. It also raises important questions, including how far context should matter in judging criminal responsibility and the construction of narratives around crimes. To explore these films, I'm joined by Dr. Mara Malagodi. Dr. Malagodi is a reader at Warwick Law School, the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Constitutions and Context, and the co-editor-in-chief of Constitutional Studies, the journal of the International Association of Constitutional Law, co-published with the Comparative Constitutions Project. Dr. Malagodi is the author of the monographs Constitutional Nationalism and Legal Exclusion in Nepal from 2013 with Oxford University Press, and The Constitutional System of Nepal, a contextual analysis, forthcoming in 2026 with Hart. She's also edited a 4-volume series on Asian comparative constitutional law and a volume on gender, sexuality, and constitutionalism in Asia. Dr. Malagodi is a non-practicing barrister, a scholar of the Honorable Society of the Middle Temple, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker who trained at EICTV, the school founded by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Cuba. Dr. Malagodi, Mara, welcome to Law and Film.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's wonderful to be here with you discussing these films.
So what got you interested in these films? How do you see these as films about law?
That's a great question. So I've always been a bit of a film buff since I was quite young. And I had an amazing opportunity towards the end of my postdoc at the London School of Economics. I was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow. So there was a little pot of money for extra training. And so I managed to convince the British Academy to send me to Cuba to train at the escuela set up by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And it was a summer program in documentary film that was run by the University College of London, the UCL, Latin American department. So it was a month of immersions in film school. And actually, I found a lot of parallels between filmmaking, from editing and the way in which we conduct our research as legal scholars. At the end of the day, but also with lawyers, we work with narratives, we work with words. And of course, filmmakers do that too, with the extra of images. And also law is incredibly photogenic, so it's attracted a lot of filmic attention.
And there's some differences, I guess, between the sort of documentary and a feature film like this. I mean, how do you sort of see those two in terms of how narratives are constructed? I guess there are overlaps, but differences as well.
I guess, I was looking at the package of the Monster DVD. I've actually just taught the class last week, really good discussions in the seminars with my students. And it's advertised Monster based on a true story. So I thought, also the way in which these particular films were marketed, Nick Broomfield's second documentary was marketed. I think there was actually a package together with Monster. So that the idea, of art and truth, and what better film genre is there to explore a very controversial story. So I thought, as the first class is quite a good case study for us to explore. And I think, they're confess and come clean that I do prefer the documentaries to the feature film. But that's kind of where I started.
And so just looking at the documentary, so there are two of them, right? We have The Selling of a Serial Killer from 1992, and then Life and Death of a Serial Killer from 2003. You sort of talk about the focus of each of the two films because they differ, I think, significantly in some respects.
Yes, with the first film, and I think, I have to say, having been a teenager in the 90s, is shockingly revealing possibly my age range. Nick Broomfield was very iconic, and I think, I had seen already some of his films. And with respect to the first documentary, there's something that I quite like about it. First of all, and I think the title gives it away, The Selling of a Serial Killer. So there is a transactional element with respect to the legal process that I thought was very intriguing. And so you have, in a way, if you look at the first film, the story arc, in a way, if you look at it, take it at face value, it's almost simple. It's a filmmaker who's trying to get an interview with an inmate on death row. But then, if you look on a deeper level, it's actually quite a profound critique of the role of the media and the criminal justice system, of the role of corruption, of the investigators, and it's a history of exploitation. Also, I have an interest in gender. So this idea of the label of America's first female serial killer had something quite intriguing about it, because it doesn't seem to me to be historically accurate, and notwithstanding that, received a lot of media attention. So it seemed quite fascinating. And in a way, the second documentary film starts with a court summons in which you have a filmmaker that has to take the witness stand. And some of the footage from the previous film becomes evidence in the appeal, in the latest appeal of Aileen Wuornos. So there was, in a way, something quite interesting in the mirroring of the two films, I felt.
And Nick Broomfield, he becomes, and you kind of alluded to, an actor in the story, and the film is, sort of the takes of the film itself, as well as I guess some of the outtakes from The Selling of a Serial Killer, become evidence in the life and death of a serial killer when they're talking about, I think, largely about her ineffective assistance of counsel, and also potentially the role of other people in the selling of her story.
Absolutely. And that's the way in which the course that I've been teaching, the law and film course that I've been teaching, focuses on. I look at representations of law, legal actors, legal institutions on film. But then I think a smaller part of the course looks at filmic interventions into the legal process. So in a way, these two documentaries kind of encapsulate both aspects of the discipline of law and film that you have. And there is, in a way, with Nick Broomfield, of himself becoming a character. That's part of his filming style. And I think, for us, being documentary film buffs in the 90s, we have very clearly that image of Nick Broomfield in a kind of goofy, really big headphones with the sound pole, featuring very much one of the main characters in his own film, a very different approach from the majority of documentary filmmakers. So I think there is that kind of element of pop culture that works quite well with these films.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I guess there's different schools in documentary filmmaking where you don't see the hand of the filmmaker, but Nick Broomfield is a character. I mean, he also becomes, beyond everything else, he develops some kind of relationship with Aileen Wuornos, which really plays out, especially in the second film.
Absolutely. And I think that's also part of the controversy of the films. And if you read some of the film studies literature about these films, especially from feminist film scholars, there is also partly a critique that while the first film is really a critique of the exploitation of this woman, a woman from an underprivileged background that is being in a way scapegoated also because of her sexual orientation, her professional engagement, and so on. But then you kind of wonder to what extent he's also complicit in that process through an exoticization of this woman. And to me, that's quite interesting as well in that respect. It's also part of his filmic style. I think, there is not a single Nick Broomfield film I can think about when you don't have one of the main characters holding out their hands in front of the camera and saying, "Stop filming," quite forcefully, and being quite annoyed. So to me, that's it's an element also of visual style. And in more substantive terms, in a case like this, there is a problematic element. We had lots of discussions over the years with my students about the second film, which is ostensibly a critique of the death penalty. And to do that in filmic terms is really seeking to emphasize the mental illness of Aileen Wuornos. And he does that with particular kind of techniques, but at the same time, the kind of dramatic tension within the film revolves around him questioning her repeatedly whether it was self-defense, especially in the first murder. And there is a particular scene in which he visits her in prison. It's a few days before her execution and pretends that the camera's off and gets her to say, camera off, that it was self-defense with respect to the first murder. So there is a question there that why you understand that as a documentary filmmaker, you want to push the envelope, but there is something that feels somehow ghoulish in observing that spectacle and makes you feel, I think, as a member of the audience, somehow complicit in that consumption.
That struck me. And just for background, so you mean Aileen Wuornos, right? So she's this woman with a history from her childhood, violence, sexual abuse. She'd been a prostitute in Central Florida and was accused and convicted of murdering 7 men between 1989 and 1990, basically sort of along the Central Highway in Central Florida, right? And, there's no question of whether she did it or not, right? I mean, she killed them. The only question is, as you said, to what extent, what were some, potentially all of the murder self-defense, but the one that seemed to me, this one where the self-defense argument was strongest was the first one, right? And they graphically depicted in Monster, in the drama, and then part of the story is why does she go on and continue to kill? But yeah, just talk, I guess, a little bit about that and that sort of the way the films approach that.
Yeah, so I think, that the focus on the first trial is really interesting because the first documentary film by Nick Broomfield really starts by presenting us with some of the evidence in the first trial. So what we see first is the mugshot of Aileen Wuornos. So I think it's also significant that the first image that you see of the protagonist, whose name the film title bears, that you have that aspect. And then you see the mugshot, and then you see the police confession, and then you see her on the witness stand being examined in the examination in chief by her lawyer in the first trial, in which effectively she describes in very graphic and moving and disturbing details the alleged sexual assault at the hand of the first victim. And I think, at that point, it's the first time that you don't see her in a jumpsuit, in a prison uniform, that really humanizes the character. And it's a very compelling piece of footage, incredibly moving and disturbing. And then you hear shortly after a voiceover with the director informing us that effectively her first lawyer failed to introduce evidence with respect to the violent sexual history, and actually, I believe, a conviction for violent sexual assault on the part of the first victim. So you have a sense already at that point, and the first trial only concerned the first victim. So you have a mistake that seems really quite glaring, where the entire trial revolves around a question of self-defense, and that was the case. So that scene, I think, does a lot of heavy lifting in the first film, and the examination in chief is also replayed in the second.
The film also explores, especially the first film, some of the other people around the criminal process, right? I don't want to talk about the defense lawyer, Steve Glazier, and his role. I mean, because there's I think a important focus on him.
Absolutely. And I think when I was discussing with my student the representation of legal actors, and of course we always start with lawyers in law films, it's quite interesting. And the legal aid lawyer does not appear very much on camera, but one of the main characters becomes the lawyer in the second trial for the next 3 victims. And the first image is very striking, that you don't see his face. You actually see this kind of monstrous doll that he has built and that he keeps on the patio of his house. And that's the first image with his voiceover. And then you hear about his background, and you're told that he doesn't really operate from a law firm, but he kind of works as a lawyer from his own house. And it's not a sort of scenario in which it's an unusual lawyer, but proves to be brilliant. It's not a My Cousin Vinny sort of
Exactly.
sort of portrayal. It's actually what you see is what you get, so to speak. That the performance of the lawyer is as troublesome as the image. And of course, the filmmaker plays on the idea. And I always ask my students, right, look at law firms. If you look at staff profiles, how are lawyers photographed? And usually they're photographed with law reports in the background. None of us uses them anymore. Of course, we're all on Lexis and Westlaw, but that's still the visual symbol of professional authority. And so, we all have those tropes. And I think the filmmakers uses those to kind of present quite a stark image. And then, of course, in the second film, what becomes the subject of Nick Broomfield, the filmmaker's testimony in court, is the so-called seven-joint ride. So it's the issue that the lawyer in the second trial, Steve Glazer, allegedly gave legal advice to a client on death row, to Aileen Wuornos, while intoxicated. So there is this kind of common thread between the two films that we have.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, you really do, and I encourage people listening to watch it. You have to see the footage of Steve Glazer to kind of get a full picture of who he is. I mean, he's just sort of like ex-hippie, sort of playing these classic rock songs on his guitar. He's smoking a joint. It was a question how many joints he smoked on the way to visit his client, Aileen Wuornos, in prison. So you get the full picture of, I kind of almost have to see it, but it's startling. And the key thing he does in connection with this woman, Arlene Prahl, who has a horse farm and adopts Aileen Wuornos as her daughter, I think for mercenary motives, and to try to watch them try to take advantage. I think Arlene Prahl is really the one behind it, to try to take advantage of Aileen Wuornos and try to sell her story. But to what Glazer does, though, is he gets at the second, at the next trial for 3 murders, basically puts up no defense. And so Aileen Wuornos pleads no contest up to the killing. So there was some, I guess, legal strategy behind that, potentially, to try to throw herself on the mercy of the court. But it's a kind of really a stark depiction of how the death penalty operates.
Absolutely. I think it's also quite interesting that if you look at the choice of the filmmaker to make this film, really begins with that very unusual legal strategy, if one wants to call it that, to advise a client who's already been handed down a death sentence in the previous trial, to plead no contest in the second trial, when without a plea bargain, the death sentence is still on the table. And that is, of course, the outcome of the second trial, that for the next 3 victims, Aileen Wuornos receives 3 additional death sentences. And we're presented with the footage from the sentencing hearing in the second trial, in which she's completely unprepared. That does not look like a defendant who has been properly advised by their lawyer that is an outcome, a potential outcome. In that case, by watching the proceedings, a very likely outcome that would be that a no contest plea would result into 3 additional death sentences. She curses the judge, she curses everyone, and she's visibly very upset by the sentence and completely unprepared.
I want to talk a little bit about the Selby character it's the Selby character that's renamed in Monster. We could talk about her depiction in Monster, but the real woman, Tyria Moore, right? She's another person. She's the one who Aileen Wuornos was in the relationship with and clearly had some knowledge about her commission of the murders, but she ends up cooperating. I think she basically disappeared. I mean, it's very clear Nick Broomfield didn't have any access to her. I wonder if you had thoughts about kind of her role around this.
Yes, that's really interesting. And I think, the love story and the betrayal, I think, it's kind of Shakespearean to a certain extent, what we see in that relationship. That you have Aileen Wuornos is a tragic character. Is this woman that effectively confesses to the murder, it looks like from the film, due to pressure from her partner. And what we see is one clip from the first trial, in which Aileen Wuornos is sitting in the courtroom while the police tape of her conversation with her partner, with a former partner, in which Tyria Moore convinces her effectively to confess to the police to the murders and puts psychological pressure on her. What we see then in some of the flashbacks or interviews with one of the former police investigators was the account that apparently some of the policemen that were eventually dismissed or transferred, who had engaged in negotiations over movie deals, had apparently secured her cooperation. So it's not said explicitly, but it's kind of hinted that she was treated not as a suspect, but as a cooperating witness, and a lot of the allegations against her not properly investigated, because in a way there was a link between the profit side of the media deals, the movie deals, and the investigation and the criminal trial.
Yeah, it's as you said. The first film really seems it's really kind of in a sense about sort of the exploitation. It's a key theme, but from the police, prosecutors, maybe potentially Tyria Moore herself, who may have gotten some money from the deals, sort of trying to get money from the story, and then Arlene Prowl, the woman who adopted her, and Steve Glazer, the lawyer, trying to get money to sell the story. So people trying to kind of profit off this woman and off these crimes, which horrible crimes as well.
But I think when we're looking at the question of profit, it sheds the light on the identity of Aileen Wuornos. And I guess one of the questions that I ended up discussing quite at length with my students was, well, why is it that this story is so appealing to Hollywood executives? What is it, right? And why is it a point that the filmmaker Nick Broomfield makes very clearly in the documentaries? She's never offered either grace or a plea bargain or nothing. And she's been compared to other notorious male serial killers like Ted Bundy. And there's something about the media portrayal of Aileen Wuornos, and even listening to the clips, murders with a feminine touch, angels of death. So there's something very sensationalized about these murders. And I guess that's also the appeal coming on to Monster, that the story continued to have even after the execution of Aileen Wuornos, that we're looking at not just a poor but a destitute defendant, a woman that grew up in really poor circumstances, a victim of family and sexual abuse since a very young age, a prostitute, and a lesbian, right? So you have almost a cumulative effect with respect to this character that becomes appealing. And there is something to this story in terms of profitability. So I think there is that angle that is quite interesting to explore. And I think that's where the film Monster kind of picks up, in a way to humanize Aileen Wuornos, but I don't find it in a way less ghoulish than the other films, so to speak.
Well, picking up on the film and even the title of the film, I'll start with the title, Monster, right? And there's an interesting analogy, or she talks about the figure of the monster, Aileen does, or Charlize Theron, who plays her.
Life is funny. It's hard. But it's also strange how things can be so different than you think. I remember I was just a kid and the 4-H club set up this beautiful, gigantic red and yellow Ferris wheel that lit up the night sky. They called it the Monster. As a kid, I thought it was about the coolest thing I ever seen, and I couldn't wait to ride it. Sure enough, when I finally got my chance, I got so scared and nauseous I threw up all over myself before it even made one full turn.
What's the idea of the monster in the film? And there's this kind of comparison to this Ferris wheel.
Yes, I guess, I would go back to gender here with respect to that. The expectations in this case, especially with serial killers, is that usually women are not active agents, they're victims. So the story of Aileen Wuornos, in a way, reverses that familiar plot in which women are victims and have no agency. And here you have a lesbian prostitute who's killed 7 of her clients within a very short span of time. And the media portrayals really give a sense of the particular kind of hatred, to quote Nick Broomfield, that this woman has attracted over the years. And it comes up even in the political wrangling that she describes over the fact that different counties, different states want to try her and execute her, that there is something with respect to political scoring with respect to the legal dealings with Aileen Wuornos. And the idea of the monster, I guess there's something that is not just about the gender dimension. I think there is also a very clear class dimension there. And it's a point that is being raised in a lot of the feminist scholarship around the films and the story itself. That I think we have with respect to the physical transformation of one of the most glamorous Hollywood actresses, Charlize Theron. So much I remember when the film came out was being made in the press about her physical transformation, her prosthetic teeth, this idea of this glamazon blonde actress being transformed into the monster. And it's kind of a reversal of some of the fairy tales almost, right? That you go from the monster that becomes the prince. You actually have the inverted process from this beautiful, glamorous woman turning into the monster and kind of wearing those clothes and successfully convincing audiences of that performance, which was a very good performance. But, I think it's actually the context in which that performance took place that added a lot to the success of the film.
Yeah, I think she watched also the Broomfield documentaries in preparing for the role.
She did. And I think, it's really interesting to see the synergies in this case between documentary films, with a very clear claim to truth and historical facts, with the feature film that through artistic license, it's interesting to see where the artistic license was taken in Monster. So on the one hand, there is the main character, the protagonist, played by Charlize Theron, playing Aileen Wuornos, that almost sometimes when you watch the films blurs the reality between, are we watching the feature film or are we almost watching real footage? And I think there was something like that with the O.J. Simpson Netflix series that was released the same year of the Oscar-winning documentary film, O.J. An American Story. So I found quite a lot of parallels from the opposite kind of end of the spectrum. So you have that kind of hyper-realism in Monster with respect to the performance by Charlize Theron playing Aileen Wuornos. And then you have a complete artistic license with respect to the casting of Christina Ricci as Selby. And it's not even the real name, right? In that case of Aileen Wuornos' former partner. And clearly what you see is a very different types of, in terms of physical appearance. The choice of Christina Ricci diverges quite significantly if you look at the clips of Tyria Moore taking the stand in Aileen Wuornos' first trial, which I thought was fascinating. And I guess, there are also commercial products they have to sell. But I think, that's part of the exoticization of the same-sex relationship between the main character and her partner that you have through casting choices.
It's striking to see kind of the difference between, Christina Ricci and then what Tyria Moore looked like. I mean, to me, two of the key themes in the movie Monster are, one is with respect to the relationship, the betrayal, right? I really think they dramatize the betrayal. And then the second is the depiction or trying to capture what Aileen Wuornos' motives were, right? What happened. The way the film comes down, it seems, is she clearly, the first murder was clear self-defense, right? They graphically depict the sexual abuse, the physical abuse. She was maybe going to be killed by this person that she picked up, shoots him in self-defense. And then this transformation, right, into the monster or not monster and why she transforms her. What happens? That seems like the sort of central question in the movie.
Absolutely, which is a question we've never really seen asked properly in the trials. That in a way, the film somehow investigates areas that none of the criminal proceedings were really able to illuminate at all. And I guess in a way there is a degree of sympathy for the monster, but I remember reading an interview with the filmmaker, and ostensibly Monster is not a film against the death penalty. So that was stated very, very clearly, if I recall correctly, by Patty Jenkins, that it was an interesting story, that, of course, there was reasons and there was an interesting story to tell about Aileen, but it was in any way not a critique of the outcome of the case. And in that sense, I find Monster very, very different from Nick Broomfield's second documentary film, which is very, very explicitly a critique of the death penalty in general, but also with respect of those specific circumstances, looking at not just the question of self-defense with respect to the first victim, but also with respect to mental illness, which I found actually much, much deeper than the feature film. And if you think about the fact that a feature film has a lot of artistic license, one could have expected perhaps a bit more. And I think the film hinges so much on Charlize Theron's performance and physical transformation for the film that actually, the more I've rewatched it, even for teaching, the more shallow I found it.
I mean, I guess it's just sort of ambivalent on the death penalty. They don't actually, you only learn that she was executed, I think, after, right, when they show the graphic titles and they tell you what happened. And the film does, because you do see the final victims where, they clearly were not self-defense, right? And then you have the sympathy. One of the victims' wife was wheelchair bound, it looked like, and another one was just not even a John, was just picking her up to try to help her, and she shoots him because he could identify her. So I guess the sympathies start to shift in the film.
Yes, and I think, while Nick Broomfield seeks to explore much more of the backstory, but it's not so much about the relationship in the second film between Aileen Wuornos and her former partner, Tyria Moore, but he seeks to explore her childhood. And I think, the family history, the history of child abuse, of neglect, of poverty. And I think that is much deeper work in which you get to understand that side. There is also something, I think, though, with respect to Nick Broomfield's film, and I guess, it's interesting for me to be on a podcast with you because I've been teaching this class and discussing this in Hong Kong and mostly in the UK. So I think for us in the UK, listening to Nick Broomfield was a British filmmaker. So even through the access, through his accent, you have a sense that you're being almost taken on a tour as outsiders of the American legal system. So there is that kind of device that you experience of being on a sort of guided tour. And with respect to the death penalty, I think, there are some points there. But I think one of the other messages that comes across that we end up discussing, going back to the money and the financial transaction, thinking about questions of due process or in the UK context, rule of law, it's also the question of access to justice. And of course, you have a right to legal representation, but not particularly a right to a competent legal representation per se. But you do wonder, equality before the law for the poor defendant, whether, you come from a marginalized background or you have identity markers or protected categories that inform your identity. What can you expect from legal proceedings in those circumstances? So I guess, there is that deeper lesson with respect to that. And we had lots of discussions once legal aid cuts were introduced in England and Wales, looking at that scenario. Is that what happens when, the state doesn't support a robust legal defense by funding it?
You get that sense, Nick Broomfield, right, outsider from the UK, coming in and looking at the US criminal justice system, especially how the death penalty operates, kind of the political legal culture around Florida, Central Florida. It does kind of give this sort of, has that outsider perspective on this sort of very troubling feature of American justice.
Completely, but also he exoticizes it. And I guess, there is been in a lot of the films, especially those on subjects who come from marginalized backgrounds. It seems to me that someone Nick Broomfield's film, especially when you're looking at this kind of circumstances and context, then he really kind of exoticizes the differences and kind of plays up his role as an outsider. He's actually, he's a British filmmaker, but he's lived in California, I think, for over 30, 40 years. So, he's someone who's very, very well versed, I think, with the American context and who's made lots of film. And some of them even with celebrities, but I guess that's part of the narrative artifice that he deploys more or less effectively. But I don't know. And I was quite curious, to be in conversation with you because, of course, a lot of my impressions are those of an outsider, and whether you picked up on that as well.
Yeah, I did a little bit. I mean, to me, one of the things that's most remarkable about what he does in the second film, and you mentioned this before, is the clear mental illness of Aileen Wuornos. I mean, it's really almost painful to watch her, how she's become delusional and sort of lost her grip on reality. I mean, the other thing was interesting, the rational choice, right? She sort of chooses to pull the plug on her appeals. At that some point, kind of wants to die, right? She thinks recognizes she has very little chance of ever getting off. It's not a DNA innocence case. And so she just basically says, nope, I did it all in cold blood, right? None of it was self-defense. So it's both the mental illness and kind of sort of the crushing pressure of being on death row for so long. I found that sort of one of the strongest parts of the film, the second film.
I agree. And I think also I picked up on something, and I think which is on the one hand, the kind of camera framing that Nick Broomfield uses in the second film. And you have really unusual, rather than the sort of BBC place your subject when you're interviewing at 2/3 of the screen, you have a lot of zooming in onto Aileen Wuornos' face, kind of using the deforming properties of the camera lens to kind of exasperate, in visual terms, the element of mental illness. And of course, you have the dialogue of the interviews and so on, the losing grip on reality, as you were saying. But visually, that's quite striking. And in a way, that's disturbing because, and that was a point that came up, I think, in the first film, when Nick Broomfield pays £10,000 to interview Steve Glazer, the lawyer in the second trial, and Aileen, the adopted mother. And he's shown this picture of Aileen and Steve in court. And Steve makes this point. He's like, well, it's one of the few flattering pictures that you have of her, that she looks happy. And actually, if you look at a lot of the visual tropes in the second film, kind of piggyback on the visual tropes used by the media at the time of the investigation, at the time of the trials, in which, the idea of the monster has very clear visual connotations, that a lot of the press reports use those pictures of her, really unflattering pictures. And it's the same that you had on the original DVD, I think, as well, this deformed face, the handcuffs, kind of exasperating those elements. And then you have, the dialogues, and I think, adding to that level of critique.
There's sort of imagery in the context. It really is of a period. The footage, it's from, well, the murders were 89 to 90. So trials are, after that, early 90s. It's around for the OJ trial. It really does the sort of media circus. I don't think that was the focus of the film, but kind of going back and looking at the documentaries, I really think it does kind of also capture the media coverage of a sensational killing.
Completely. And I guess you have the media coverage, but it's also the impact of the media coverage on the trial. And I guess for us observing this from the UK, you're not allowed to record in a criminal courtroom. I think Scotland's different, but England and Wales as a jurisdiction, so we're really not used to it. The idea of having that kind of media presence in the courtroom. And it's not about the fact that you can go as a member of the public and attend most criminal trials should you wish, unless the judge has placed restrictions in order, whether that be a terrorist case or children are involved or vulnerable defendants. But in that case, it seems really integral. So the law, in a way, we talked about at the very beginning of our chat, as the law being photogenic, but then the legal process becomes spectacle rather than, you go from photogenic to circus-like. And there is that transition where you think, isn't justice somehow lost in this transformation of the legal process into a spectacle? And whether, it's no longer about transparency, but it's about consumption.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's sort of way the law seems limited and flawed. I mean, in the documentaries and to some extent in the feature film, right? I mean, you talk about the commodification, right? The way the death penalty operates in the Nick Broomfield documentaries. And then to some extent, I mean, I don't know if that's the focus of the film in Monster, but just the sort of inability of the legal system to capture sort of what happened and then sort of to understand, what motivated or led Aileen Wuornos to commit these crimes. You have this sort of binary of self-defense versus cold-blooded murder. And after the first one, at least, right, it seems like it's, she claims self-defense, or at the beginning she claims self-defense, but it doesn't really fit within the legal category of self-defense. It's a much broader concept of self-defense.
Absolutely. And you do wonder, right? You speculate, had her lawyer been successful in introducing evidence, convincing evidence of self-defense, and had the charge been dropped to a manslaughter charge, or had she been acquitted, would that have had a knock-on effect on the later trials? Could they have argued that it was better wife syndrome, sort of better wife syndrome, PTSD, that in some other ways it would have resulted not in Aileen Wuornos maybe still being convicted, most likely, but not receiving death sentences?
It seemed sort of unjust or a misapplication of law that she was not acquitted, at least in the first trial, or the self-defense wasn't recognized. And I think that does set it up. I mean, I think the self-defense as a legal matter, the self-defense claim would have been much harder in the other cases. But I think you're right. I do think, maybe there would have been a plea, or she would have gotten a life sentence or something else. But she also, right, it's like she sort of gave up, right? I think the documentary, I think, captures that after she was convicted in the first trial, she really just kind of gave up on the system.
Yes, and I think she repeats that in different media interviews, in her outbursts at the time of the sentencing hearing, that you're sending to death a woman that was raped. And there is this idea of profound, I think, sadness and desperation surrounding the fact that such a violent act was not recognized at all, right? That there was a mistake from her own lawyer in the first trial of not adducing the relevant evidence, potentially a mistake from the trial judge of letting evidence concerning the later murders before the jury. So a number of appeal grounds that you would imagine that a competent lawyer could have done quite a bit with those in the circumstances. So the sense is really the desperation also of witnessing a legal process that fails a poor defendant so spectacularly. And I think, in a way, all of the films end up kind of focusing on other aspects linked to her identity rather than the spectacular failures. And with respect to that, so I've also been wondering, watching these films, whether the media portrayal of Aileen under a particular light as the monster, to what extent have they shaped the perceptions of the jury? Would the legal process being able even to find an unbiased jury? I think that was one of the issues with OJ, the difficulty of kind of containing the jury away from the media circus. So that doesn't come up quite as much in the Aileen Wuornos, but it seems that with that kind of coverage, it would have been very difficult to find a more impartial adjudicator.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you're right. I mean, it's there in the film. It's there in the Nick Broomfield films, the sort of failures of the process. You mentioned, the failure of the first lawyer to uncover the evidence of the victim's sexual violent crimes. I think the judge allowing in evidence that probably shouldn't have been allowed in. There was also an issue with the prosecutor not disclosing information. I don't think it's his focus, but, if you kind of peel a little bit deeper, there is a good amount there about the procedural failures in this case.
Completely. And I think especially documentary films, when you're thinking about due process, rule of law, constitutional protections, so at the end of the day, I'm not a criminal lawyer. I am a constitutional lawyer. So they're kind of reflections on the big C of the constitutional dimension. And you really wonder, to what extent the constitutional promise of equality before the law is really then realized. And you really look at that dissonance between the law in books and the law in action that is particularly disturbing. And in a way, you understand that it gives the dramatic engine to the film. But I think for us as viewers, especially for us with an interest and professional stakes, it is a very bitter message that you come away with.
Yeah, that and the death penalty, which I think is at the end, the kind of final words in the commentary of Nick Broomfield, second documentary, when he says something to the effect of, you're clearly executing someone who's severely mentally ill, and that's very troubling. I mean, it's something to that effect.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, the second film, for all its flaws, I don't think it's a perfect film, but it still works as a very powerful critique of the death penalty, especially under those conditions. And I think, it shows in very clear terms what the issues are, not just with that particular case and with the kind of conditions that inmates are going through.
And, a lot of the film, I mean, she's already been sentenced, right? So you have all these years while she's on death row. I mean, a little bit about about the appeals, the issues in the appeals, but also about kind of what it's like to be on death row. And then about, as you said, Nick Broomfield accompanies, former people from her neighborhood, go back and revisit her past. It's sort of like the aftermath of the trial, if you will, and kind of what that's like. So that's another part of the movie.
Absolutely. And I think, going back to what we were discussing at the beginning, the filmic representations of legal actors and going back to lawyers, it's only in the second film that you are confronted as a viewer with a competent attorney. Finally, you have a character who's what you would expect. A lawyer who's highly skilled in death sentence, in handling death sentence appeals and death penalty cases. So you have the kind of heroic lawyer that appears, but there is also very bitter messaging is that you have to get to that point that it's your last possible appeal, that it is only at that point with a case that has attracted that kind of media attention that the poor defendant has access to that kind of legal representation. And I think, there is a very bitter irony, for lack of a better expression, of kind of noticing that patterns with respect to the legal representation that she's had. And that, to me was also, and it was also with my students when we were discussing, kind of contrasting the approach of the lawyers, the way in which they're filmed, that there was that kind of sad realization there as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to undo the work of some of the prior lawyers. Any other sort of things that struck you or stuck out to you about the films and whether documentary or the feature film?
I think, with the documentaries, there was the element of exoticization. I think, and I was reading a piece by a film studies scholars talking about the almost racialization of the racialized transformation of Charlize Theron from glamorous actress into a working class prostitute who's also a lesbian, right? So the idea that it has a very specific set of visual elements there. And I thought that was quite interesting, per se, kind of linking those different elements there. And I felt, that the portrayal had something over the top with respect to the US, that there was the element of exoticization. But it's, as an outsider, that's just impressionistic rather than, I guess, accurate. And I was quite curious about that. And it's actually the first time that I have a discussion with a colleague from the US on this. So I guess that element.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm from, New York. So there's that level of like exoticization within America, kind of looking down and going and looking at what happens in Florida. And you got that with the documentaries, especially tried to kind of look into the sort of Central Florida subculture, right? There's the bar that she went to.
The human bomb.
The human bomb who seems to like kind of try to blow himself up, right? Who knew her. Like there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of exoticization even within the United States. I think from kind of like from the Hollywood, coastal LA, coming down and looking at this sort of subculture that it's kind of, peeling the layers of the onion off.
Yes, that kind of reminds me of Sandra Bullock's character in The Time to Kill, right? Perhaps that's an apt parallel.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm glad it's not just for the outsiders that, there is an element that resonates.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the sort of aspects of the legal system, but there's something about it that just seems, the depiction of that sort of time and place in Florida that's quite different, I think, from, some other
I see.
cultures.
Okay, I'm glad I picked up on something that resonates.
So, Mara, it's been so great to have you on the podcast to talk about these films and the issues they raise. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's been great fun.